It all started so innocently. My name is Sarah, and I've been married to Michael for almost 10 years. We live a quiet life in the suburbs, the kind of life many people would envy. Michael has always been a good husband, kind, responsible, and loyal. He provides for our family, never missing a birthday or anniversary. But as the years went by, I couldn't help but feel something was missing. Our conversations became routine, our date nights few and far between. It felt like we were more like roommates than partners in love. I never imagined myself as someone who would betray my husband. The thought seemed unthinkable. But I suppose it's true what they say, you never know until you're in the situation. It began at work, with someone I never expected to have feelings for. His name was Eric, my new colleague. He joined the team a few months ago, a tall, dark-haired man with sharp features and an easy smile. We worked in the same department, spending hours together on various projects. At first, it was purely professional. I didn't give him much thought beyond work-related matters. But slowly, things began to change. Our interactions grew more personal, more relaxed. We talked during breaks, lingering a bit longer by the coffee machine, chatting about our lives outside the office. He'd tell me about his love for hiking, how he enjoyed exploring nature on the weekends. I, in turn, would share little stories about my family, how my son, Jacob, was growing up so fast, and how my husband was always busy with work. Eric would listen, really listen, in a way that Michael hadn't in a long time. There was a comfort in his presence, a sense of being seen and heard. I found myself looking forward to our conversations, wondering what he would say or how he would make me laugh that day. It was harmless at first, just a bit of friendly banter. But soon, I began to notice a shift in the way he looked at me. Longer stares, subtle touches when he passed by my desk. And I didn't pull away. In fact, I started to enjoy it. One evening, we were the last ones left in the office, finishing up a project that had taken far longer than expected. The air was heavy with the tension of the day's work, and as we sat together, side by side, reviewing documents, something changed. Our conversation drifted away from work, and before I knew it, we were talking about more personal things. Our marriages, our struggles. I admitted to him how disconnected I felt from Michael, how lonely I had been, despite being married. Eric didn't say much, but he didn't need to. His eyes told me everything. There was a quiet understanding between us, an unspoken bond formed out of shared experiences. We were both seeking something more, something that our marriages weren't providing. And in that moment, the lines blurred. He leaned in, his hand brushing mine, and for a second, I froze. This was the moment where I could stop it, where I could remind myself that I had a husband waiting for me at home, that I was a mother, a wife, someone who shouldn't be doing this. But I didn't stop it. I let him kiss me. It was a soft kiss, tentative at first, as if we were testing the waters. But the longer it went on, the more it deepened, the more I felt something stir inside me that I hadn't felt in years. Desire. Passion. It was like waking up from a long, numb sleep. My body responded to his in a way that I hadn't with Michael in so long. When we finally pulled apart, there was a silence that filled the room, the weight of what we had done sinking in. I should have felt guilty, ashamed. But all I felt was alive. I wanted more. We didn't speak much after that, both of us knowing that things had changed between us. I went home that night, my mind spinning with what had happened. Michael was already in bed, his back turned to me as I slipped under the covers. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my lips still tingling from Eric's kiss. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about what might happen next. The days following that kiss were filled with tension. At work, Eric and I pretended nothing had happened, but every glance we exchanged told a different story. There was a hunger between us now, an unspoken agreement that we wanted more. I tried to focus on my job, on my family, but I couldn't get him out of my head. One afternoon, a week after that kiss, he found me in the break room alone. Without saying a word, he closed the door behind him and stepped toward me. My heart raced as he pressed me against the counter, his body close to mine. "Is this what you want?" he whispered, his lips inches from mine. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My body responded before my mind could catch up, and we were kissing again, more urgently this time. His hands roamed my body, and I didn't resist. I wanted this, craved it even. We pulled apart just as the door opened, and one of our coworkers walked in. The moment passed, but the desire didn't. From that day on, our relationship became a dangerous game. We found moments to steal away, to touch, to kiss, to indulge in the chemistry that was building between us. We hadn't gone further than that, but it felt inevitable. Every time I was near him, I felt like a live wire, buzzing with anticipation. At home, I was distant from Michael. I avoided his touch, his attempts at affection, making excuses about being tired or stressed from work. The guilt gnawed at me, but it wasn't enough to stop what was happening with Eric. I convinced myself that it was just a fling, something to fill the void in my life. Something that wouldn't mean anything in the end. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Eric and I hadn't slept together yet, but it felt like we were on the edge of it, like every interaction was leading us closer to that point of no return. And as much as I tried to ignore it, I wanted it. I wanted to feel desired, wanted to feel that spark that had long since faded in my marriage. One evening, after another long day at work, I stayed late once again. Eric was there too, and as the office emptied out, I felt that familiar pull between us. This time, neither of us hesitated. We ended up in his office, the door locked behind us. We didn't speak as we kissed, our bodies pressed together in the dim light of the room. It was intense, overwhelming, and in that moment, all thoughts of Michael, my marriage, my life outside of that office, vanished. There was only Eric and the way he made me feel. As our clothes came off, the reality of what I was doing hit me, but I pushed it aside. I had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The moment I let Eric touch me like that, I knew there was no going back. Everything felt like a blur, the feel of his hands on my skin, the taste of his lips. It was wrong, so incredibly wrong, and yet it felt more right than anything had in a long time. We didn't waste words. The tension that had built up between us was finally being released, and there was no need to explain anything. For the first time in years, I felt desired, like someone saw me as more than just a wife and a mother. Eric's touch was different from Michael's. It was hungry, impatient, like he couldn't wait to have me. And I couldn't wait either. In the quiet of his office, with only the hum of the building's ventilation system in the background, we gave in to the desire that had been simmering between us for weeks. I told myself it was just physical, that it was something my body needed, something I could compartmentalize. But even as I lay in his arms afterward, the reality of what I'd done hit me. I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Afterward, we dressed in silence. Eric gave me a look, one that was both tender and conflicted, as if he too was realizing the gravity of what we'd just done. I expected to feel crushing guilt, like I'd be overcome by the weight of my betrayal. But the truth was I didn't. Not in that moment. I felt alive, wanted, seen in a way I hadn't been in years. It was like I had woken up from a long sleep. But the real world wasn't so kind. When I got home that night, Michael was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He didn't even look up when I walked in. The house was quiet. Jacob was already in bed, the dishes from dinner still sitting in the sink. It was the kind of scene I had become all too familiar with. "Hey," Michael said without looking up. "Hey," I replied, my voice hoarse, the guilt starting to creep in. "Long day?" "Yeah, just lots of work." I felt sick to my stomach as I said it, the lie heavy on my tongue. But Michael didn't seem to notice. The days after that night with Eric felt surreal. I had expected the guilt to overwhelm me, to make me break down in front of Michael, confess everything, and beg for forgiveness. But instead, I found myself slipping into a strange kind of normalcy. I would wake up, make breakfast, and go to work, all the while carrying the secret of what I had done like a shadow that followed me everywhere. Michael, as usual, barely noticed. He was wrapped up in his own world. Work, the TV, his phone. He wasn't a bad husband, but the spark that had once been between us had long since faded. We didn't fight. We didn't talk much either. Our interactions were practical, surface level, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had become accustomed to it. At work, things with Eric were complicated. After that night, we didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't need to. Every time our eyes met, there was an unspoken understanding between us, a shared secret that both thrilled and terrified me. We continued our dangerous dance, finding moments to be alone together, kissing in the shadows of the office when no one was around. But I knew it wouldn't stay secret for long. People talk. People notice. And sooner or later, something was bound to slip. One Friday afternoon, a few weeks after that night in his office, Eric asked if I wanted to grab a drink after work. It wasn't unusual for our team to go out for happy hour, but this invitation was different. It wasn't a group event. It was just the two of us. I hesitated, my heart racing at the thought of spending time with him outside the office, away from the pretense of work. But I said yes, knowing full well where it might lead. We met at a bar not far from the office, a quiet place where no one would recognize us. The conversation started off light, the way it always did, talk about work, about how crazy the week had been. But as the drinks flowed, the conversation shifted. He asked me about my marriage, about Michael, and I found myself opening up to him in a way I never had with anyone before. I don't know when it started, I said, swirling my glass. But it's like we're just existing together. We're not really living. There's no passion anymore, no excitement. I love him, but it's not the same. Eric nodded, listening intently. He always listened in a way that made me feel like I was the only person in the room. Do you think it can change? He asked softly. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Maybe I've changed. Maybe we both have. He reached across the table and took my hand, his touch sending a familiar rush through me. You deserve to be happy, Sarah. Don't settle for less than that. His words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that I deserved more than the life I had settled into. But at what cost? I had already betrayed Michael, and the more time I spent with Eric, the more I felt myself slipping away from the person I used to be. As the evening wore on, the bar grew quieter, and the space between us felt more intimate. We talked about everything, our hopes, our regrets, the paths we had taken in life. It was dangerous territory, but I couldn't stop. Being with Eric made me feel alive in a way that I hadn't in years. By the time we left the bar, it was dark outside. We stood by my car, the tension between us palpable. I knew what was coming before it even happened. He leaned in, his hand brushing my cheek, and kissed me. This time, there was no hesitation. I kissed him back, my arms wrapping around his neck as if it were the most natural thing in the world. When we finally pulled apart, I felt breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. Come home with me, he whispered, his voice low and filled with desire. For a moment I was tempted. The thought of being alone with him, of giving in completely to the passion that had been building between us, was intoxicating. But something held me back. As much as I wanted him, I wasn't ready to take that final step. Not yet. I can't, I whispered. Stepping back, my mind suddenly flooded with thoughts of Michael and Jacob, of the life I had built and the life I was risking. Eric looked disappointed, but he didn't push. I understand, he said softly. But it's not over, is it? I shook my head, unable to trust myself to speak. I didn't know how to answer that. Part of me wanted to say no, to end it before it went any further, but another part of me knew the truth. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I drove home that night, my mind racing with conflicting emotions. The guilt was starting to creep in, the realization of what I was doing weighing heavier on me. When I walked through the front door, Michael was asleep on the couch, the TV still on. I stood there for a moment, watching him, feeling like a stranger in my own life. How had it come to this? How had I allowed myself to get so far from the person I used to be? I went to bed that night, lying awake in the darkness, unable to shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and one more step would send me tumbling into an abyss I couldn't escape from. The next few weeks were a blur of confusion, guilt, and desire. I found myself caught between two worlds, the life I had with Michael and Jacob, and the secret world I was building with Eric. I was living two lives, and the weight of it was beginning to take its toll. At home, I was distant. Michael noticed, of course, but he didn't push. He never did. He would ask if I was okay, if something was bothering me, and I would just smile and say I was fine. But I wasn't fine. I was unraveling, slowly but surely. Work became an escape, a place where I could be with Eric and forget, even if just for a little while, the mess I was making of my life. We continued our affair, sneaking moments together whenever we could. It was reckless and I knew it, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. And then, everything came crashing down. One afternoon, I was sitting at my desk, trying to focus on a report when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Michael. "We need to talk when you get home."
My heart sank.
There was no mistaking the tone of that message. He knew. Somehow, he knew. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't think about anything other than the conversation that awaited me at home. I avoided Eric, not trusting myself to be near him, knowing that I had to face the consequences of my actions. When I walked through the door that evening, Michael was sitting at the kitchen table, his face pale, his expression grim. The silence in the house was suffocating. "Sarah," he began, his voice strained. "I found something." My stomach dropped. Michael's words hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. My mind raced, trying to figure out what exactly he had found. Was it a text? An email? Had he somehow seen Eric and me together? The possibilities swirled in my head as I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding. "What did you find?" I managed to ask, my voice shaky, already dreading the answer. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he slid his phone across the table toward me, his eyes filled with hurt and confusion. I hesitated for a moment, afraid of what I would see. But I forced myself to pick up the phone, my hands trembling as I unlocked the screen. There was an email I had sent to Eric a week ago. Nothing explicit, but the tone was unmistakable. I had written to him about how I couldn't stop thinking about our time together, how I longed for the moments we could steal away, how I felt more alive with him than I had in years. My heart sank as I realized that I must have accidentally synced my work email to our shared cloud account, and Michael had seen it. I felt sick. All the lies, the secrecy, it had all come crashing down in a single moment. "I didn't mean to read it," Michael said, his voice tight with emotion. "I was just backing up some files, and I saw it. But once I started reading, I couldn't stop. I had to know." The silence that followed was unbearable. I could feel his eyes on me, searching for an explanation, an apology, something that would make sense of the betrayal. "Michael," I began, my voice barely a whisper, but he cut me off. "How long?" he asked, his voice raw. "How long have you been lying to me?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. I wanted to tell him it wasn't what it seemed, that it hadn't meant anything, that I still loved him. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was that I had betrayed him. I had betrayed us, and there was no way to take it back. "A few months," I finally admitted, my throat tight with guilt. "It started a few months ago." Michael's face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought he was going to cry. But instead, he stood up from the table, pushing the chair back with a harsh scrape against the floor. "A few months," he repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. "Jesus, Sarah. How could you? How could you do this to us? To Jacob?" The mention of our son hit me like a punch to the gut.
Jacob.
I had been so wrapped up in my own selfish desires, in my affair with Eric, that I hadn't even thought about how this would affect him. How my actions were tearing apart the family we had built together. "I don't know," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "I didn't plan for this to happen. It just happened." "Things like this don't just happen," Michael snapped, his voice rising in anger. "You made a choice. You chose to be with him instead of me. You chose to lie to me every single day." His words cut deep because they were true. I had made choices, terrible choices, and now I had to face the consequences. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm so sorry, Michael. I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," he said, his voice quieter now, the anger giving way to hurt. "You hurt me, Sarah. You destroyed everything." I didn't know what to say. No amount of apologies could undo the damage I had done. We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, neither of us knowing what to say or do next. The weight of my betrayal hung heavy in the air, and I could see the pain etched on Michael's face. "I need some time," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I need to think about what to do next." He turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen, the full weight of my actions crashing down on me. I had known this moment would come eventually, but I hadn't been prepared for just how devastating it would feel. I had betrayed the man I had promised to love and cherish for the rest of my life. I had shattered the trust between us, and now I was left standing in the ruins of our marriage, wondering if there was any way to salvage it. The days following Michael's discovery were some of the hardest of my life. He didn't speak to me unless it was absolutely necessary, and when he did, it was short, clipped answers. He spent most of his time at work or out of the house, avoiding me, avoiding us. The once comfortable silence we used to share had turned into something cold and oppressive. At night, he slept on the couch. I would lie awake in our bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind, wondering how I had let things get this far. I missed him, missed the way things used to be between us before everything had gone so horribly wrong. But at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about Eric. Eric had tried to reach out after that night at the bar. He sent me texts, asking if I was okay, if I wanted to talk. But I ignored them. I knew I had to make a choice. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, caught between two worlds, two men. One evening, after Jacob had gone to bed, Michael came home and sat across from me at the kitchen table. His face was tired, worn, like he hadn't slept in days. He looked older somehow, and it broke my heart to think that I had been the one to cause that. "I've thought about this a lot," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "About what we're going to do, about whether we can fix this." I held my breath, not knowing what he was going to say. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Sarah," he continued, and I felt my heart sink. "But I'm willing to try. For Jacob's sake, for the sake of the life we've built together. I'm willing to try. But I need to know that this is over. That it's really over." Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded, knowing that this was the moment of truth. I had to make a choice. "It's over," I said, my voice trembling. "I promise, Michael. It's over." And I meant it. As much as I had been drawn to Eric, as much as he had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years, I couldn't destroy my family for him. I couldn't lose Michael and Jacob. They were my life, and I had to find a way to repair the damage I had done. Michael stared at me for a long moment, as if he was trying to gauge whether or not he could believe me. Finally, he nodded, though the sadness in his eyes remained. "I'm going to need time," he said. "This isn't going to be easy, but I want to try." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I'll do whatever it takes, Michael."
I'm so sorry.
That night, he didn't sleep on the couch. He came back to bed, though there was still a space between us, a distance that hadn't been there before. I lay next to him, listening to the sound of his breathing, wondering if things would ever truly be the same again. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, we began to try to rebuild our life together. It wasn't easy. The trust between us had been shattered, and there were moments when I could see the doubt and pain in Michael's eyes. But he was trying. He was giving me a chance, and I was determined not to waste it. I cut off all contact with Eric. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I missed him, when I thought about the way he had made me feel. But I reminded myself of what I stood to lose if I gave in to those thoughts. I couldn't go back to that life. I couldn't hurt Michael again. Our relationship was fragile, like a piece of glass that had been cracked but not yet broken. We were careful with each other, tiptoeing around the subject of my affair, but eventually, we had to confront it. We went to counseling, something I never thought we would need, and it helped. It helped us talk about the things we had buried, the things we had ignored for too long. Michael admitted that he had been distant, that he hadn't been paying attention to the signs that something was wrong between us. But he also made it clear that my choices had been my own, that I had betrayed him in the worst possible way. And I had to own that. I had to take responsibility for the pain I had caused. There were days when I wondered if we would ever truly heal from this. But there were also days when I saw glimpses of the life we used to have, the love that had brought us together in the first place. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. As the weeks went on, the strain between Michael and me started to ease, just slightly. We had settled into a fragile routine, one that revolved around small gestures of goodwill and tentative steps toward healing. But trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. There were moments when I caught Michael looking at me with a mix of hurt and suspicion, and it tore me apart inside. I knew it would take time, maybe a lot of time, but I was committed to doing whatever it took to fix what I had broken. Counseling had become a regular part of our week. At first, I had dreaded those sessions, not wanting to rehash the details of my affair or face the raw emotions that lay beneath the surface. But slowly, I began to see the value in them. Our therapist, a kind but firm woman named Linda, didn't allow either of us to hide behind platitudes or avoid the difficult conversations. She pushed us to talk about the things we had ignored for years: Michael's emotional distance, my feelings of loneliness, the slow erosion of our connection. "We need to get to the root of what caused this," Linda had said during one particularly difficult session. "Affairs don't just happen in a vacuum. They're often a symptom of deeper issues within the relationship." She was right, of course. The affair with Eric hadn't been about him specifically. It had been about the way I felt in my marriage, the way I had slowly become invisible to Michael, the way we had drifted apart without even realizing it. Eric had simply filled a void, one that I should have addressed with my husband long before things had gone so far. Michael, for his part, was trying. He was coming to the sessions, engaging in the conversations, and making an effort to reconnect with me. But I could tell it wasn't easy for him. Trusting me again, letting me back into his heart after I had broken it, was a monumental task, and I knew he was struggling with it every day. One evening, a few months after everything had come to light, Michael and I sat down for dinner after Jacob had gone to bed. It was one of those rare, quiet moments where the house felt peaceful, and for the first time in a while, I felt like we could talk without the weight of the affair hanging over us. "I've been thinking a lot," Michael said, breaking the silence. He toyed with his fork, not meeting my eyes at first. "About everything that's happened. About us." My heart skipped a beat, fear creeping in that this was the moment he would tell me he couldn't do it anymore, that he couldn't forgive me. "I know I've been distant," he continued, his voice softer now. "For a long time before all of this. I thought I was doing enough by providing for us, by making sure we had everything we needed. But I wasn't paying attention to what you really needed. And I'm sorry for that." His words caught me off guard. For so long, I had blamed myself entirely for what had happened. I had convinced myself that I was the only one at fault, that my affair had been a selfish, unforgivable act. But hearing Michael acknowledge his own part in the breakdown of our marriage made me realize that we had both contributed to the distance between us. "I'm sorry too," I said quietly, reaching across the table to take his hand. "For everything. I didn't handle things the right way. I should have talked to you, told you how I was feeling, instead of—" I trailed off, the weight of my words sinking in. We both knew how the sentence ended. "Instead of betraying you." Michael squeezed my hand, his expression softening. "We're both at fault here. But I want to try, Sarah. I want to move past this. For us. For Jacob." A lump formed in my throat, and I fought back tears. I had been waiting for this, for some sign that Michael was still willing to fight for our marriage, despite everything that had happened. "I want that too," I whispered. More than anything, it was a small step, but it felt monumental. For the first time in months, I felt like there was hope, like maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. As Michael and I worked on rebuilding our marriage, the outside world began to feel like a different kind of pressure. At work, things were complicated with Eric. After I had cut off all contact with him, I had done my best to avoid being alone with him. But we still worked in the same office, still saw each other in meetings, and there were moments when the weight of our shared past felt impossible to ignore. Eric, for his part, had been respectful of my boundaries. He didn't push me to talk, didn't try to rekindle what we had. But every now and then, I would catch him looking at me from across the room, his expression unreadable. It was like he was waiting, wondering if I would ever come back to him. One afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting where we had been forced to work closely together, Eric pulled me aside as I was about to leave the office. "Sarah," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Can we talk? Just for a minute." I hesitated, my heart racing.
I didn't want to talk to him.
I didn't want to reopen old wounds, but something in his expression made me pause. "Okay," I said finally, crossing my arms defensively. "What is it?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I want to say I'm sorry. For everything. I know things got out of hand, and I didn't mean to put you in a difficult position. I didn't mean to make things harder for you." I stared at him, surprised. Of all the things I had expected him to say, an apology wasn't one of them. "I don't regret the time we spent together," he continued, his voice soft. "But I understand why you chose to end it. And I respect that." His words left me feeling conflicted. There was a part of me that still remembered the excitement of being with Eric, the way he had made me feel alive and desired. But that part of me was fading, replaced by a deeper understanding of what I stood to lose if I had continued down that path. "I appreciate that," I said, my voice more steady than I felt. "But I can't go back, Eric. I'm trying to fix things with Michael. I can't have you in my life right now." He nodded, his expression pained but understanding. "I get it. I just wanted to say that. I'll leave you alone from now on." With that, he walked away, leaving me standing there, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over me. It felt like the end of something that had never really had a chance to be real. As I drove home that evening, I realized that this was it. The door to that part of my life was closing for good. Whatever had existed between Eric and me was over, and now it was time to focus on the life I had almost thrown away. The months that followed were difficult, but slowly, things began to get better. Michael and I continued to work on our marriage, rebuilding the trust that had been shattered. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, still moments when I could see the pain in his eyes. But we were moving forward, one step at a time. We made more of an effort to spend time together, to talk, to really see each other again. We went on date nights, took Jacob on family outings, and slowly, the distance between us began to close. There were still days when I felt the weight of what I had done, when the guilt threatened to overwhelm me. But Michael was there, willing to forgive, willing to move past it. And I knew I had to be willing to forgive myself, too. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, Michael turned to me and smiled, a real smile, one that reached his eyes for the first time in a long time. "I think we're going to be okay," he said softly, reaching for my hand. I smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through me. For the first time in a long time, I believed him. "We will be," I whispered, squeezing his hand. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I truly felt hopeful. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but we were on it together. And that was enough. The decision to rebuild our marriage wasn't easy for either of us, but it was a choice we made together. After months of tension, secrets, and pain, Michael and I were finally moving in the same direction again. Our therapy sessions were helping us confront the issues we had long ignored, issues that had created the emotional distance between us in the first place. I began to realize that the affair hadn't been about Eric at all. It was about feeling disconnected, about searching for something I thought I had lost with Michael. The spark, the excitement, the intimacy that had faded over the years wasn't gone. It was just buried under the weight of our busy lives, our routines, and our unspoken frustrations. One evening, after another successful therapy session, Michael suggested we go for a walk. It was a warm evening, with the sun just beginning to set, casting a soft glow over our neighborhood. As we walked side by side, hand in hand, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. "You know," Michael began, his voice thoughtful, "I was thinking about our first date the other day." I looked at him, surprised. It had been years since either of us had brought up our early days together. "Oh, yeah." I smiled. "What made you think of that?" He chuckled softly. "I don't know, really. I guess I was just remembering how nervous I was." I kept rehearsing what I was going to say, trying to make sure I didn't screw it up. I laughed, squeezing his hand. "You didn't screw it up. I thought you were charming." "Charming?" He raised an eyebrow, a playful grin spreading across his face. I was a nervous wreck. "I think I spilled water on myself at one point." "Maybe," I teased. "But you won me over." We walked in silence for a few moments, the memories of those early days washing over me. I had forgotten what it felt like to be that young and in love, to feel the excitement of getting to know someone who could change your life forever. "I miss that," Michael said quietly, breaking the silence. "I miss us." I stopped walking, turning to face him. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, one that I hadn't seen in a long time. For so long, we had been going through the motions of our marriage, but now, standing here, it felt like we were starting to rediscover each other. "I miss us too," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "But we're still here, Michael. We're still us." He smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made my heart ache with both love and regret. "I know, and I want to get back to that. I want to find that connection again." "We will," I said, determination in my voice. "I know it's not going to be easy, but I'm willing to fight for this. For us." Michael nodded, his grip tightening around my hand. "Me too." We continued our walk, the silence between us no longer heavy or tense but comfortable, filled with the promise of a new beginning. As the weeks turned into months, Michael and I made a conscious effort to focus on each other in ways we hadn't for years. We started spending more time together, not just as parents or partners in a routine, but as two people who were rediscovering the love that had once brought us together. One Friday evening, Michael surprised me by arranging for Jacob to stay with my sister for the night. When I came home from work, the house was quiet, and I found him in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the air, and soft music played in the background. "What's all this?" I asked, smiling as I set my bag down. Michael turned, a glass of wine in his hand, and offered it to me with a smile. "I thought we could have a date night. Just the two of us." I couldn't remember the last time we had done something like this. Planned an evening just for us. I took the glass, feeling a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the wine. "That sounds perfect," I said, sitting down at the kitchen counter as I watched him finish cooking. The evening was simple, but intimate. We ate together, talking and laughing in a way we hadn't in a long time. There was no pressure, no heavy conversations about the past, just the two of us enjoying each other's company. It felt like a glimpse of what our life could be again, if we continued to work at it. After dinner, Michael suggested we watch a movie. We curled up on the couch, his arm wrapped around my shoulders, and for the first time in months, I felt truly at peace. I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and wondered how I had ever let myself drift so far from him. As the movie played, I realized that the physical distance that had once felt so insurmountable between us was finally closing. We hadn't been intimate in months, partly because of the affair, partly because of the emotional barriers that had grown between us. But now, sitting here, I felt that old familiar spark begin to reignite. I turned to Michael, our eyes meeting, and without a word, we both knew. He leaned in, kissing me softly at first, his lips warm and tender against mine. It was different from before, not rushed or driven by guilt, but full of genuine love and desire. It felt like we were rediscovering each other, not just physically, but emotionally. As the kiss deepened, I felt the weight of everything we had been through start to lift, replaced by the warmth of the connection we were rebuilding. I realized that this was what I had been missing. Not the excitement of something new, but the deep, enduring love that only comes from truly knowing and trusting someone. That night, we made love for the first time in what felt like forever. It wasn't just about the physical act, it was about reconnecting, about choosing each other all over again. As we lay together afterward, tangled in the sheets, I felt a sense of hope that I hadn't felt in a long time. "I love you," Michael whispered, his hand brushing through my hair. "I love you too," I whispered back, my heart full. And for the first time, I truly believed that we were going to be okay. The months that followed were filled with small victories, as well as challenges. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, but with each passing day, I could feel the gap between Michael and me closing. We weren't just coexisting anymore. We were partners again, working together to heal the wounds we had both caused. We started planning small trips as a family, taking Jacob on weekend getaways, and spending more time together as a couple. The simple act of sharing experiences, of creating new memories, was helping us forge a new bond. There were still moments when the past would creep in, when something would trigger a memory of the affair, and I would see the flicker of hurt in Michael's eyes. But instead of letting it drive a wedge between us, we would talk about it, acknowledging the pain and reaffirming our commitment to each other. One evening, after putting Jacob to bed, Michael and I sat on the porch, watching the stars. The air was cool, and the silence between us was peaceful. "You know," Michael said after a while, his voice thoughtful, "I've been thinking a lot about where we are now, about everything we've been through." I looked over at him, waiting for him to continue. "I used to think that trust was like a glass. Once it was broken, it couldn't be fixed. But I think I was wrong. Maybe it's more like a muscle. It gets hurt, sure, but if you work at it, if you take care of it, it can heal. It can even grow stronger." I smiled, my heart swelling with love for him. "I like that," I said softly. "And I think you're right." We sat there for a while longer, holding hands, both of us knowing that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but feeling hopeful about the journey we were on together. Michael and I had faced the hardest challenge of our lives, but we had come through it stronger, more connected, and more in love than ever before. We had rediscovered each other, and in doing so, we had found a way to move forward, not just as husband and wife, but as two people who had chosen to fight for their love. As time went on, life began to settle into a new, healthier rhythm for Michael and me. We weren't just healing from the affair, we were building something stronger in its place. Our relationship felt more honest than it ever had, grounded in communication and mutual effort. It wasn't perfect, but we had learned that perfection wasn't the goal. Connection was. We continued with counseling not because we were still struggling, but because we realized how much it helped to keep things out in the open. There was no more silence, no more brushing things under the rug. We made a habit of checking in with each other, of being honest even when it was uncomfortable. The wounds from the past were still there, but they were scars now, reminders of what we had been through, but no longer open or painful. One weekend, Michael suggested we take a family trip to the beach, something we hadn't done in years. It felt like a perfect way to celebrate how far we'd come. We packed up the car and drove down to the coast, with Jacob excitedly chattering in the back seat the entire way. When we arrived at the beach house, it felt like a fresh start. The sun was bright, the air salty and warm, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel the weight of the past hanging over me. We spent the days playing in the sand with Jacob, splashing in the waves, and enjoying each other's company without the tension that had once filled the space between us. One evening, after Jacob had gone to bed, Michael and I sat on the porch, looking out at the ocean. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was soothing, and for the first time, I felt a deep sense of peace. Michael reached for my hand, intertwining our fingers. "I'm really glad we did this," he said softly, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. "It feels good to just be together, without everything else." I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder. "Yeah, it does." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us watching the moonlight dance on the water. After everything we had been through, moments like this felt even more precious. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were thriving. "Do you ever think about the future?" I asked suddenly, surprising myself with the question. Michael turned to look at me, his brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I said, shrugging. "About what comes next, about how things might change, or what we want out of life now." He was quiet for a moment, thinking it over. "I do," he admitted. "I think a lot about what the next chapter of our life looks like. Honestly, I'm excited for it. For the first time in a long time, I feel like we're really on the same page, you know?" "I feel that too," I said softly. "I want us to keep growing together, to keep making this life something we both love." He smiled, his expression tender as he leaned in to kiss me. We will. The beach trip marked a turning point in our marriage. It wasn't just about healing anymore, it was about dreaming again. For the longest time, we had been stuck in survival mode, just trying to get through the day-to-day without falling apart. But now, for the first time, we started thinking about what we wanted for the future, not just for Jacob, but for ourselves. Michael had always been a dreamer at heart, though he had set many of his dreams aside over the years in favor of stability. But now, with the renewed sense of closeness between us, he began to share those dreams with me again. I've been thinking about starting my own business, he told me one night after Jacob had gone to bed. It's something I've wanted to do for a while, but I was always too afraid to take the risk. I looked at him, surprised but excited. You should do it, Michael. You've always been good at what you do, and if it's something you're passionate about, I think it's worth the risk. He smiled, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. You really think so? I know so, I said, reaching across the table to take his hand. We've been through so much, and if we can get through that, we can handle anything. I'll support you, whatever you decide. That conversation opened the door to a new chapter for both of us. Michael began to seriously explore the idea of starting his own business, and I found myself excited for him. It felt good to support him in something that he cared about, and I knew it was a step toward building the life we wanted together. As for me, I started thinking about my own dreams, the things I had put on hold over the years. I realized that I had been so focused on everyone else, on Jacob, on my job, on keeping the family together, that I hadn't taken the time to figure out what I wanted for myself. One afternoon, while sitting in the park watching Jacob play, I turned to Michael and said, I think I want to go back to school. He raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard. School? For what? I've been thinking about it for a while, I admitted. I've always wanted to study psychology, maybe even become a therapist. I think, after everything we've been through, I want to help other people the way our counselor helped us. Michael smiled, nodding slowly as he considered my words. I think that's a great idea, Sarah. You'd be amazing at that. I felt a warmth spread through me, excited at the thought of finally pursuing something that was just for me. Really? Absolutely, he said. I'll support you, just like you're supporting me. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just living for everyone else. I was living for myself too. And it felt incredible. As we both began to chase our dreams, our marriage continued to grow stronger. The love and respect that had been buried under years of routine and unspoken resentment were now at the forefront of our relationship. We weren't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, still moments where the past tried to rear its ugly head, but we were better. We were a team again, supporting each other in ways we hadn't for years. Michael's business idea started to take shape, and I watched with pride as he poured himself into his work. He was passionate, focused, and determined to make it succeed. It was like I was seeing a new side of him, a side that had been dormant for so long. As for me, I enrolled in night classes to start my journey toward becoming a therapist. It was challenging, balancing school, work, and family, but I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I was doing something for myself, something that I believed in, and it felt empowering. One evening, as I was sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing notes for an upcoming exam, Michael came over and sat beside me. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me with a soft smile on his face. What? I asked, laughing as I looked up from my notes. Nothing, he said, shaking his head. I'm just proud of you. I don't think I've said that enough. His words made my heart swell with emotion. I'm proud of you too, I said softly. We sat there in comfortable silence for a moment, just enjoying each other's presence. It felt like we had finally found our rhythm again, not just as husband and wife, but as individuals who were growing and changing together. I think we're doing okay, I said, smiling at him. We're doing better than okay, he replied, leaning in to kiss me. We're doing great, and for the first time in a long time, I believed him. We were on a new path now, one that wasn't defined by the mistakes of the past, but by the hope and possibilities of the future. As the months passed, our lives continued to evolve. Michael's business started to gain momentum, and my studies brought me closer to my goal of becoming a therapist. We found a balance between our personal ambitions and our family life, something we had struggled with before. Jacob thrived, happy to see his parents working together, laughing together, and being more present in his life. We made sure to create moments that were just for us as a family, weekend trips, game nights, or even just walks in the park. It was a simple life, but it was ours, and it was enough. One evening, after putting Jacob to bed, Michael and I sat together on the couch, reflecting on everything we had been through. "You know," he said, wrapping his arm around my shoulders, "I don't think I could have imagined us getting here a year ago." "Neither could I admitted. "But I'm glad we did." He nodded, his eyes full of warmth as he looked at me. "Me too. I feel like we've built something stronger this time." "We have," I agreed, resting my head on his chest. "And it feels good." As we sat there, listening to the quiet of the house, I realized that we had come full circle. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer defined us. We had chosen to fight for our marriage, to rebuild it from the ground up, and in doing so, we had created something even more beautiful than what we had before. We weren't just surviving anymore, we were living, and we were doing it together. As life settled into its new rhythm, the stability that Michael and I worked so hard to rebuild became more natural. We no longer had to consciously remind ourselves to communicate or prioritize each other. It had become a part of our everyday lives. Our relationship felt solid, grounded in the shared understanding that we had been through the hardest part and emerged stronger on the other side. Michael's business had taken off more quickly than either of us expected. The hours he put in were long, but he was passionate about it, and the excitement he felt radiated through our home. There was a lightness in him that I hadn't seen in years. Every day, he came home with new stories, new successes, and every time, I was reminded of why I had fallen in love with him in the first place: his determination, his drive, and the way he made even the toughest challenges feel surmountable. Meanwhile, I was deep into my studies, pushing myself harder than I had in years. Balancing work, classes, and family wasn't easy, but I found a sense of fulfillment in pursuing something I truly cared about. With each class I took, I felt more confident that becoming a therapist was the right path for me. It wasn't just about helping others. It was about understanding myself, about learning how to navigate the complexities of relationships, communication, and forgiveness. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table, finishing an assignment for school, Michael came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my shoulders. "You've been working hard," he murmured, his lips brushing my ear. I leaned into him, smiling. "So have you." "We're a pretty good team," he said, pulling out a chair to sit beside me. I nodded, closing my laptop and turning to face him. "We are. And I'm proud of us for getting here." Michael's face softened, his eyes full of warmth. "I am too. I couldn't have imagined it a year ago, but I'm happier now than I've been in a long time." "Me too," I admitted, taking his hand. "I feel like we've really found our way back to each other." He smiled, leaning in to kiss me gently. It was moments like this that reminded me of the depth of our love, the way it had weathered the storm and come out the other side even stronger. I felt at peace with the journey we had taken, knowing that every challenge we had faced had brought us to this moment. With the foundation of our marriage stronger than ever, Michael and I began to look toward the future with excitement rather than apprehension. His business was thriving, and my studies were bringing me closer to my goal of becoming a licensed therapist. We both had dreams now, dreams that we were working toward individually but also together. One weekend, as we were sitting outside watching Jacob play in the yard, Michael turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about what you said a while back about the future." I looked at him curiously. "What about it?" He smiled, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "I think it's time for us to take the next step." My heart skipped a beat, unsure of where this was going. "The next step?" He nodded, glancing over at Jacob, who was chasing the family dog around the yard. "We've rebuilt our relationship. We've found our balance. But I think we could add something more to our lives." For a moment, I wasn't sure what he meant. Then it clicked. My eyes widened in surprise. Are you saying? Michael grinned, nodding. What do you think about having another baby? The idea caught me off guard, but as soon as he said it, something inside me warmed to the thought. It was a conversation we hadn't had in years, not since Jacob was a toddler. Back then, life had been too chaotic, too uncertain to think about expanding our family. But now, after everything we had been through, the idea didn't feel scary. It felt like a natural next step, something that could bring even more love and joy into our lives. I don't know, I said slowly, trying to wrap my head around it. I hadn't really thought about it, but I kind of like the idea. Michael's smile widened. I've been thinking about it for a while. I just wasn't sure if it was something you'd want. I took a deep breath, letting the possibility settle in. The idea of a new life, a new beginning, was exciting. It felt like a symbol of how far we had come, a testament to the strength of our love and the family we had built. I think I want that, I said finally, meeting his eyes. I think I want to try. Michael pulled me into a tight embrace, kissing the top of my head. I'm so glad to hear that. I want to build something more with you, Sarah. We sat there in comfortable silence for a while, watching Jacob play, both of us thinking about the future we were now planning together. The decision to try for another child brought a new sense of excitement into our lives. It wasn't something we rushed into, but the idea of expanding our family felt like the perfect way to close one chapter and begin another. We talked about it often, making plans for the future, discussing how life might change with another baby in the house. Our conversations about the future were filled with hope and possibility, where we wanted to live, how we would balance our careers and family life, and the kind of life we wanted to create for our children. It was a far cry from the uncertainty and fear we had felt not so long ago, and it made me realize just how far we had come. As the months passed, Michael's business continued to thrive, and my studies brought me closer to my goal of becoming a therapist. I had started interning at a local counseling center, working with couples who were navigating the complexities of their own relationships. It was incredibly rewarding work, and it made me even more grateful for the journey Michael and I had taken together. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were thriving, and we were building a future that was full of love, connection, and purpose. One afternoon, as I was getting ready to leave the counseling center, my phone buzzed with a message from Michael. It was a picture of Jacob, proudly holding up a drawing he had made, with the caption, "Future big brother in the making?" I smiled, feeling a surge of love for both of them. Life wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of doubt and fear, but those moments were fleeting. The love we had for each other, for our family, was stronger than anything else. Months later, I found out I was pregnant. The news filled our home with joy and excitement. Michael was over the moon, and Jacob was thrilled at the idea of becoming a big brother. The pregnancy was a new chapter for us, a reminder that life could continue to grow and evolve, no matter what challenges we had faced in the past. As the months went on, we prepared for the arrival of our new baby. Michael was attentive and loving, always making sure I had everything I needed. Jacob was curious and excited, constantly asking questions about the baby and what life would be like once they arrived. The house was filled with laughter, hope, and anticipation for the future. It felt like a second chance at everything, the opportunity to not only strengthen our marriage, but to build the family we had always dreamed of. And as we moved forward, I knew one thing for certain. No matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, as a team, as a family. Our love had been tested, but it had come through stronger, and now we were ready for whatever the future had in store.